Good evening. Good evening, everyone. We'll get everybody settled here. My name is Katheryn Allgore, and I'm going to say still new president of the Massachusetts Historical Society. I still have that new president smell. I want to welcome you here tonight. You know, it's funny when I'm in this room, it's amazing. About an hour and 15 minutes ago, this was a hushed haven for scholarly work. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Dan and his team and facilities, including Harry, the famous Harry who came in on his day off to turn it this way, and Chris, who's making us all lovely and lit and loud. So thank you to them. I have to tell you, I am taking a little bit of a perverse pride in what's happening here. The idea that we're in this esteemed old building, beautiful, gracious, seemingly timeless, and yet the conversation we're having here is so progressive and so cutting edge. Somehow the contrast of that really tickles me. And it's also important for you to know that this is a continuing conversation. So the first time I met at least some of our panelists was a year ago, September, we convened a huge sort of conversation about public history. It was called The Future of History. And I think we had about 70 people. And rather than doing like panels, we'd have to choose a panel, we tackled topics and had everybody participate. And it was about half academics and half people who work in the field of public history. So I'm so pleased to be continuing that conversation. So I'm going to turn this over to Gavin, who's going to let you know who's up there and why. Gavin.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. So as Katheryn mentioned, the planning for this program began about a year ago. Following our conference on the future of history, our research department, which at the time was Conrad Wright and Kate Viens, continued in a conversation with Richard Rabinowitz, in which in this email discourse, Conrad happened to mention that he had just finished reading and very much enjoyed Richard's new book, Curating America. That sort of started a conversation through email and then through meetings with Conrad, Kate, and me, where we discussed putting together a panel where we would sort of tackle some of the issues that were brought up in Richard's new book. So after many discussions, we have assembled the panel that you see before you, which I think is an amazing group of people, and it is a great pleasure for me to introduce them tonight. So to begin with Richard Rabinowitz, who started the conversation, his career has spanned over 50 years, presiding, he's the president of the American History Workshop. He has led creative teams in developing new museums, exhibitions, media presentations, and curricular programs in 34 states in the District of Columbia, with over 570 projects in all. Among this number have been the Lower East Side Tenement Museum in New York City, the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, and a series of blockbuster exhibitions on the history of slavery in the New York Historical Society. He has a BA and a PhD from Harvard, and his most recent book is Curating America, Journeys Through the Storyscapes of America's Past. Available for order at home. Carolyn Crockett, on the corner, is the Director of Economic Policy and Research for the Mayor's Office of Economic Development. She holds a PhD from the American Studies program at Yale University, a Master's of Science in Geography from the London School of Economics, and a Master's of Art and Religion from Yale Divinity School. Her research focuses on large-scale land use changes in 20th century American cities and examines the social and geographic implications of structural poverty. Carolyn's dissertation, entitled People Before Highways, Reconsidering Routes to and from the Boston Anti-Highway Movement, investigates the 1960s era grassroots movements to halt urban extension of the interstate highway system. And I believe that this is coming out as a book in January. And going way, way back, about 6 years ago, Caroline and I worked on panel discussions on the history of the Inner Belt in Cambridge. So we've been doing this for a while. Yeah. Prior to graduate school, she founded the Multicultural Youth Tour of What's Now, also known as My Town, an award-winning educational nonprofit organization. It was essentially a group that hired high school students to research their local family histories and produce youth-led walking tours to the general public, and was highly acclaimed. Brian LeMay, sitting next to Carolyn, served for more than a dozen years as the executive director and president of the Bostonian Society Library and Old State House Museum. He was deputy director of the International Center at the Smithsonian Institute and chair of the Smithsonian Forum on Material Culture. He organized a number of exhibitions as well as scholarly and public programs. He was the editor of quarterly journal Material Matters for 5 years and is currently preparing a study of evolving modes of presentation and interpretation in museums and public places. Finally, our moderator this evening is Kate Viens. She is the director of research at MHS. She is a scholar of the early republic and material culture. She holds an MA in history from Northeastern University, where she concentrated in public history, and is currently writing a history dissertation in the Boston University American and New England Studies program. She was previously the executive director of the New England Museum Association, also known as NEMA, where she developed professional development programs for colleagues working in history, art, science, and children's museums, and helped to develop the standards and excellence program for history organizations of the American Association for State and Local History. She is also the former director of the Old Colony Historical Society in Taunton, Massachusetts. So I think we have a very qualified group of panelists, and I will turn it over to Kate.
Thank you very much, Gavin. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Our format this evening will be that each presenter will have about 10 minutes in which to share their thoughts on the role of public history. Then I'll pose some questions to the panelists, and then after 15 minutes or so, we'll open the conversation to the audience for questions and answers. And my hope is that we will explore both the role of public history as well as how we put our ideas into practice. And we will begin this evening with Richard.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks to all of you, and glad to see so many old friends in this audience and colleagues, really stretching back to the 1960s. I started in this world, I wouldn't call it a business, in 1967, so this is 50 years. A little bit before that, in September of 1966, I came into this room for the first time. I was a first-year Harvard graduate student, and I got off the train, the T at Mass Ave, and walked over here. And I noticed as I was walking here that the H.E. Harris and Company stamp company had an office. That's where their office was. And as a child, I had been buying stamps from these people for my stamp collection. So I thought, boy, this is an interesting, that's where it is. You know, I had no idea. I'd been sending, you know, I got my dad to write checks for $1.26 and send it off to Boston, someplace in Boston. And I came into this room and I asked for the copy of a diary of an American loyalist who was living in London, and I started to read it, and I just, you know, began to doze off, and I couldn't quite get it, and I didn't know enough about London. I didn't know enough about why he had gone into exile and so on. So I went back to Widener and I started to read some of the background material. This was a seminar with Professor Bernard Balin, and I'd been an undergraduate at Harvard and I was stayed on, and it was a mistake. I really needed to get out of here and do something else. So in January of that first year, in '67, I borrowed a car and I drove out to Old Sturbridge Village, and I just had this revelation of a day, a kind of road to Damascus conversion experience where I just felt the materiality of the past, and all those connections were so important. So the next day I borrowed a car again and drove back out there and talked myself into a job as a $1.10 an hour costumed interpreter at Old Sturbridge Village. Those of you who've worked for me know this story, because everybody who's ever negotiated a wage from American History Workshop has had to suffer through the story of how low the pay was in 1967. I loved that work, and I eventually came back to Cambridge, finished the degree work, the exams and stuff, and then I started a dissertation, and I went back to Sturbridge and began my professional career there as well. And I thought, being the ancient person on this panel, that I would just sort of try to bring us through a sense of what's happened since the 60s and to this field. I didn't think that I would be a museum person. I didn't think that I would be a public historian. Nobody could have called me a public historian in 1967 because the words didn't exist. But I just wanted to teach history to all those people. You know, on Mondays, we used to, at Sturbridge, we'd get a lot of honeymooners starting out, and then weekends we'd get, you know, families with surly teenagers and squally babies. And I just thought everybody needed to know the story of the transformation of New England from a kind of agricultural settled community into this kind of period of industrial ferment and political change. And I was just tremendously impassioned by that work. The work that we were doing at Sturbridge was part of a transformation in the way public history was told. In a way, you know, we started out, my friend Sandy Levinson is here, and he always taught me about civil religion. There was a kind of consensus in America, and public history was basically, museums were basically in the business of celebrating the consensus that America was a progressive, democratic society in which there had been certain reverses, like the Civil War, but for the most part, it had been onward and upward. Economic prosperity, the advancement of scientific knowledge, democratization, it sort of moved in a steady way. Well, of course, if you've been watching television lately, you know that the 1960s were a more tumultuous time. And so one of my generation's tasks was to introduce a kind of critical perspective on American history, to find the incidents and the patterns in American history that were more disruptive issues dealing especially with race and with, but also with immigration and violence of all sorts, tremendous changes in family life. And over the course of the last 50 years, it's really it's just an amazing change has taken place. In those years, we were basically in danger of losing almost all of our industrial heritage to wrecking balls. And some people here have been very instrumental in preservation of that legacy. Ellis Island and Angel Island, our great immigration stations, were in ruins. There was not a single building or historic site or historic neighborhood in the United States that interpreted the lives of working class people. Almost nothing interpreted 20th century history at all, and certainly not problematic things. And especially if you went to a plantation house, even Mount Vernon and Monticello and Montpelier, I'm not sure that was open then, but you know, you were basically had this kind of gone with the wind, lost cause interpretation in which there was phrases, a kind of passive voice was used. Dinner was served, the food was cooked, the fields were harvested. We didn't exactly know by whom. And Williamsburg still used the word servants. So the idea of the centrality of slavery, I just came from a memorial service for the great James Oliver Horton, who was a great historian, and he used to teach us that that slavery was not the sideshow of American history, it was the main event in American history. So the idea of introducing a more critical perspective on history was really basic to my generation's work. At the same time, we wanted to make that history more vivid, more accessible. And at Sturbridge, I got a chance to create hands-on learning opportunities in this great education center that we built. And I tried to make the story of the history that we were teaching something that people could feel in their fingers. And of course, part of this came from growing up in a household with a mother, particularly, who was a woman with very little schooling, but who had this tremendous knowledge in her fingertips. And I wanted to make my career into some way that could bring respect to people like that, who had tremendous skills in their hands, but didn't leave diaries and write long letters that would be preserved at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And we wanted to build our history not in a kind of progressive, step-by-step, ever onward and upward sort of chronological approach, but to focus on themes. And then ultimately in the 1980s, we began to focus on stories. At the Tenement Museum in New York, we really tried very hard to learn how to take individual family stories and how they responded to the crisis of assimilation and acculturation and often poverty and economic depression, and try to understand how those issues could be related to contemporary life. And all of this required a tremendous professionalization. And when I started in this field, you know, it was a field in large measure for amateurs. Many historic house museums were run by local committees, and some of the scholarship was a little suspect. Some of the furnishing of the houses was done with a sense that they were creating spaces that would give people advice on how to furnish their own homes, rather than sort of doing the work that, especially historic New England, it's SBNEA, great scholarship in doing all those paint layers and getting it down and trying to understand the real remoteness of the past. So that professional work, and then trying to understand that we were also in the business of making museums, making public history more transparent, showing the documents, showing the techniques that we used, explaining what kind of curatorial choices we were making. So at the end of 50 years, I have to say, this has all happened. I mean, I'm done. This is it. Everything I dreamed of in 1967 has happened. It's all come true. So why am I so unhappy? You know, you look in the newspaper and there's history, public history on every front page, right? Monuments, controversies. Today, the museum in Washington is said to be in financial trouble. There's tremendous discoveries of new material. African American documents are still being uncovered in collections we didn't know where they were. There's tremendous liveliness in the field. And there are a couple of things that I think are coming about in our field that I think are very significant. One has been a kind of movement, and I say these things not because I'm sure that they're good or bad, but because I think it's useful to just throw them out as issues for all of us. Increasingly, our historical agencies are focusing really on contemporary life, and not necessarily with the kind of sophistication, that context that Carolyn is bringing to the history of Boston and transportation and how that engaged the tremendous upheaval in demographic changes in this city, but rather with a kind of, almost a kind of, let's just get people to sort of talk about their own lives. And there's a tremendous emphasis upon first-person narrative. And I'm partly responsible with my colleagues, our generation. We loved oral history, and we did a lot of it. Now, oral history threatens to swallow the field in many ways. And part of that is the vividness that comes. We've all grown up. You know, when I was a kid, there was 15 minutes of news every day on the radio that we listened to. And of course now, since the first Iraq War, we have around-the-clock cable news. And much of that news is interviews with people on the spot. We can now do that. We couldn't do that in Vietnam even during the Vietnam War. So we've now become overwhelmed in a certain sense with the value of witnesses and the immersion we have in witnessing. And I want to raise that only because I think there's a kind of compensatory voice that's grown less confident, and that is the people standing back, giving it a longer look, and giving it some deeper context. In the museum world, of course, now we bring people in and they've all got these things in their hands. And many young people, in a sense, are going through the exhibit, and we've worked so hard to create engaging exhibition technologies and new media, and now there's a mirror. You know, now we can put a video screen anywhere at any size, and we can mount it and engage people. But we get a lot of visitors who are sort of spending their whole visit sort of looking at their own screens. And so how do we deal with that fact, with that kind of quality that in some ways it's very hard to sustain the attentiveness, and that's a key word for me in this process. And finally, in the last few years, and I think in a beneficial way, the advent of a kind of sense of crisis, especially in race relations and policing in our cities, generating the Black Lives Matter movement and other kinds of social crises, have pushed museums to adopt or to explore an advocacy role and to really become part of the local conversation. And there are wonderful groups in many, many institutions. Museums respond to hashtag Museums Respond to Black Lives Matter. There are groups called the Empathetic Museum. There's a wonderful association called the Coalition of Sites of Conscience, which has about 200 members around the world that are taking the South African model of truth and reconciliation commissions and turning that into the center of their program, so that our history museums are in some sense becoming centers for community, the exploration of community grievances and hurts. And this is a fascinating kind of change because it's very different from the kind of world, the kind of scholarly detachment that my generation. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that I worked so hard in my career, happily and successfully, I think, to make museums into more vivid places, more successful, engaging, joyful, painful, but exciting and palpably exciting places. And now, you know, I'm not too sure. I need to know whether or not the things that I also valued about scholarship and context and conversation can be sustained. So that's the challenge that I think going forward, you know, having achieved everything that I wanted to do, I'm really feeling even more anxious than ever. So thank you.
Brian?
As the second oldest person on this table, I guess I'm inclined to think about the recent developments in public history and the role of public history in modern life as involving some older questions about, and it's difficult to escape thinking about this in a venerable institution like this, but the authority of public institutions that still hasn't been widely discussed publicly, and I think perhaps is still largely unresolved. Although, alas, books apparently are becoming less prominent public medium, and we still can point to a few prominent public historians whose primary medium is the printed page, public history presentations, I think, still require some sort of public platform in the form of an institution from which to deliver public history. And it seems to me that the respect and the attention that's claimed for utterances of public historians is still based, at least in part, on the authority and stature of public institutions from within which they present their history, where presentations are commonly attributed to the institution rather than, as a whole, rather than to the individual historian. Unfortunately, there are still few exhibitions that are signed by one primary curator or organizer. Now, I think that museums and public institutions generally claim the authority to speak with some believability about particular subjects for two reasons. The first is that they present themselves as presenting and embodying institutionally what society has deemed to be of some importance, important to the culture. Scientific specimens in science museums that reflect the respect that science is given within the culture, or art that's considered to embody some of the highest aspirations of the culture, or historic materials even. The second is that I think these institutions imply that they represent institutionally the consensus views of the culture about these important matters. Because, well, almost tautologically, they are public institutions. Now, although there are professional organizations that define accepted best practices and bestow accreditation on institutions, there's no one objective standard of how a consensus among historians or scientists or museum people, how a consensus about a particular content is determined, or about how, when an institution's programs do reflect a consensus, this qualifies the organization to declare itself a public institution. As the National Council on Public History, a representative of which I think we might have here one or two of, as the NCPH defines it, and as it's commonly understood, public history performs a somewhat different public and social function than academic history. And museums and public history institutions similarly occupy a somewhat different realm and mission than higher education academic research institutions. So for the moment, perhaps we can define public history as the means of transmitting elements of historical scholarship into the public realm, or as the NCPH refers to it, into real-world issues, where even matters that have long been considered uncontroversial among professional academic historians have elicited vehement reactions from the general public when they've been presented in museums or in the public sphere. We declined for many years to recognize this until I think it became undeniable about 30 to 35 years ago in a series of controversial exhibitions that now seem to mark a turning point in the history of museums and the so-called culture wars, beginning with an exhibition called The West as America in a museum that was then called the National Museum of American Art, followed by the notorious Robert Mapplethorpe exhibition, funded in part by the NEA, and culminating in the aborted National Air and Space Museum exhibition that was to have marked the 50th anniversary of the way that World War II ended with a bang. So permit me briefly then to suggest that most public history institutions, like other kinds of institutions, exist not only to promote the theoretical interests of the public, but fundamentally to promote the interests of the people who establish and maintain them. I think this is true even when they're publicly supported public institutions, like government museums or libraries or historic sites, which are not often established and maintained by a majority vote of the public. Elected government officials may propose, establish, and maintain institutions with public funds on behalf of their public constituents, and thereby implicitly base the authority underlying these institutions on an implied public good, for which, once again, I believe there are no standard official codes, except perhaps the tax code, but I think that's subject for a different panel. Or, on the other hand, there are wealthy collectors or people with deep beliefs who may establish museums because they have deep interest in the subject matter, or they have sufficient funds to establish them, and if they can provide sufficient support, ongoing support, they may do so without requiring any groundswell of public support at all or consensus about the importance of the institution's content or its mission. There are, for instance, 16 creationist museums in the United States in 12 states, as well as Canada, China, and the UK, and one coming in a national capital near you. A discussion about these sources of authority now seems to me to be especially important and timely for a number of reasons. And I'm sure that you can all think of some from recent politics and developments here in this nation, but farther afield, there have been some discussions worldwide recently about the democratic process in other places. Two recently and so far peaceful efforts to assert self-determination by major groups of people have met with broad international opposition because there's no recognized right to secede under international law. And most nations, perhaps understandably, instead prefer to uphold other nations' rights to maintain their national boundaries. Two principles that may be argued to be exactly at odds with those propounded in the founding documents of this country. So there are examples, I think, of things that are remarkably relevant today for presentations of public history that are curiously absent or inconspicuous in presentations by public institutions for obvious reasons. And because the interests of the public may not entirely coincide with those of public institutions, established and maintained by only a segment of the populations, it might be argued that public history cannot be defined only as that which public institutions now present to the public. So what should be the basis for the authority of public history generally? One would have thought that this, at least, would have been all hashed out in endless detail by now and resolved, but in the public, at least, there's only clearly a vague notion of what history is. This is not simply a nitpicking issue of semantics. The repeated comments associating the removal of Confederate monuments with the so-called erasure of history makes it perfectly clear that there's a widespread public confusion about what constitutes the data or the raw material of history and what constitutes celebrations of particular historic points of view and what constitutes the reasoned interpretation of evidence, which I suspect most of us here will agree is what really constitutes history. During the height of the Enola Gay controversy, Smithsonian Secretary Michael Heyman famously suggested that the beleaguered Air and Space Museum curators should simply put the artifacts on view and let them speak for themselves, which neatly articulated what source material is and breathtakingly sidestepped the role and the responsibilities of public history. And I'm not sure whether we've progressed that far since then. History, I think, does have something to do with historians, because those with knowledge about history or science or art are in the best position to explain what the significance of the data, the artifacts, and the events are, or were. Forgive me for once again stating the obvious, but history is what historians write. And it's their obligation to explain what the raw material means. It's inherently relative because historians each view the material from somewhat different perspectives, personally, from different cultural and economic perspectives, of course. And even more strikingly, I think, is that they each view it from different perspectives in time. Cruelly, time constantly shifts our view on things, and public history, for whatever its perspective, has the important task of translating the research of scholars into the language of the public by explaining its significance to us all at particular moments in time. I believe, therefore, that the authority to speak resides with the individual public historian, who has an ethical responsibility to explain historic significance and meaning as honestly and as transparently according to his or her perspective as possible. Perhaps with the democratization of communications through social media and other electronic means, institutional authority may be displaced by that of individuals. Some of us are incorrigibly subversive, of course, some of us more than others, but we must acknowledge that the perspectives and interests of certain cultural and economic groups may be inherently at odds, or at least perceived to be at odds with those of groups that establish and control public institutions that we rely upon to provide the platforms for public history. And when these perspectives and interests come into clear conflict, we're shocked to encounter public controversies, for which managers of institutions like this are sometimes criticized as being threatening to the support base of the museum or the research institution. It's a tribute to the dedication and the integrity of public museum staff and historic organizations, members, that the public largely trusts museums. Of course, this is relative. They trust museums more than government, certainly, but that may be a backhanded comparison and more a reflection of the integrity and honor of governments than of museums. But there are those who have also argued that controversies may be inherent in the work of public history if it is to be truly democratic. And perhaps, these subversives argue, allowing controversy and encouraging a diversity of conflicting perspectives is the responsibility of public institutions and historians.
Carolyn.
Thank you so much. Good evening. It is wonderful to be here. Gavin and Kate, thank you for assembling us. I didn't realize that our panel was ranked in descending order of age or time somehow. I thought we were assembling as colleagues, but I'll take the challenge. It's truly wonderful to be here with a group of folks sitting at this table who have really dedicated themselves professionally and their focus to thinking about the uses of history. I think we hold in common this idea that we know that history is not just something that needs to be in a box or under a glass, but it's something that we use, that we examine, and there's something about how it lives in the world and what we do with it that is our charge to kind of zero in on that. As beautiful as the box of the Mass Historical Society is, it is important to kind of move beyond here. I'm reminded that actually when I was 13, which was a while ago, not as recently as you might think, but when I was 13, I used to come around the corner because I was an 8th grader at Boston Latin Academy. And many of you may know that Boston Latin Academy used to be right back here across from Fenway in the old post office building, right? And it was amazing for me because it was the first time that I got to travel out of my neighborhood to go to school. I was born in Dorchester. My family lived there, went to school in Dorchester until I got to come around the corner, but I did not know this building was here. But I tell you, I walked by it every single day for about 2 years when I missed the Queensbury bus that would come right there. So this feels like my neighborhood a little bit in a way that I didn't know. And this theme for me of kind of neighborhood boundary crossing and trying to explore the city has been really an important part of my own story in ways that I just did not know as a 13-year-old, but something that would really inform the way I understood what Boston is. This is a very powerful city to be born in, to live in, to come of age. I'm reminded of this every time I look at our tourism stats, and I was just looking at these the other day. I think the stat of 2016 is that there were 28 million people, international domestic folks that came to Massachusetts and with laser eye focus on Boston to come and gobble up all of our sites. And they brought with them, I think, $20.7 billion in direct spend. And part of why they come here is because they want to see all these places and they want to know who are we? not just as Bostonians, but who are we as Americans, right? People try to come here to get inside that story. Who are we? Whether you're from some other part of the United States, or you're from Europe, or you're from Latin America, wherever you're coming here to understand who we are as Americans, and what does that even mean? And I would venture to say that in the middle of this story is a constant story about flight, about fugitivity, about movement, about people trying to find, what do we say, a better life, a better place to be, and the struggle of trying to make that make sense. And for me, as a kid growing up in the city, even moving from one neighborhood to another, there's an echo of that story. What is this city about? Who is it for? Not just what was it about in 1620 or before, whatever that mythical time is, but what is it about now? And I think that for me now, as someone who I feel like I have infiltrated city government for the last 3 years, and have had the benefit of kind of taking the story inside City Hall and asking, well, I'm not sitting here as someone that represents a historical society or historical organization, but someone who cares about history, who's worked in the field, who has that training, and is now inside of a government building, which on some days feels like the most historically averse place you can imagine. But what does it mean to bring in a sense of history into the city's machinations, into the city's effort to make itself? And how am I informing that as the person who works on policy for the mayor? How am I informed by that as a young daughter of the city, as someone whose own family narrative was shaped by this idea, I would say, of fugitivity. So my family came to Boston in about 1957 from West Virginia, and a lot of what they were fleeing at the time was economic devastation of the coal mines. So there's this sort of industrial history that's shaping my family narrative. And they were also fleeing from the racial terror of the South at that time, and what would it mean to come to Boston as a place to square those two truths: economic opportunity, the promise of racial liberation, and could you find that here? And so it has been a challenge, right? And many folks would say that we fall under this umbrella of what historians would say, the Great Migration. Well, I would say it wasn't that great, and they probably should have stayed. So I don't know how you characterize it. I think Isabel Wilkerson does an incredible job of really telling that story in great detail. And the story for me, I think, as the daughter of African-American migrants, is also the story of how internal migration and also racial terror as a vector has really transformed so many cities around the United States, in the North, in the South, in the great Southwest, and how do we kind of get that into the narrative of how we're understanding how cities have come into themselves in the post-war period. So why does that matter? And why does that matter for Boston? I appreciate very much, Richard, your sort of framing of these kind of a 50-year kind of bracket in a way, because I think for me, in thinking about the uses, again, of history and what it means, these last 50 years in our own city are not insignificant. I'm thinking very much about the fact that, as Boston sort of thought, well, I think of Mayor Collins, sort of Mayor Collins in 1960 announcing his urban renewal strategy, and what that unleashed in terms of city infrastructure, physical face, in terms of moving people around. And then to flash forward to 2015, where you have Brian Golden, who's the director of the Boston Redevelopment Authority, issuing a formal apology to the West End and all of its families for the devastation that the city of Boston officially, in its official capacity, unleashed on that neighborhood. And so what did we learn in those 50 years of city making and that time of really trying to bring the city into the future, into its modern self? What did we learn about statecraft? What did we learn about the machinations of policy and politics, and what did we get wrong? And now, fast forwarding to 2017, when the city has now released its new plan, its new citywide plan. Some of you may know Imagine Boston 2030, which is supposed to bring us into the next 17 years. So 2 questions. One, is there a way for the process or the experiment of city making to learn from a city's own history? What is the responsibility of historical societies, of historians, of activists, of citizens to really push that story? So we're not just talking about a biography necessarily or a memorial, but what to do with that. I'm also thinking very much about Bryan Stevenson's current effort to create a national memorial to lynching in the United States. Some of you may have read about this. So the 4,384 known lynchings will be commemorated in a memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. And what a sort of a heart-wrenching way to try to mark erasure. How do you think about the landscape of all the cities and towns, particularly where lynching, where that erasure of communities, of real estate, of capital, of black bodies is now worked into the telling, the imagining of Montgomery's modern landscape? So for me, lots and lots of questions around, again, placemaking, more than that, around city making, around governance, around how can history be bound up into that, not just as an attempt to look backward, but an attempt to live in this moment and to push forward for sure. But there's got to be that reckoning. And I think that is not a question that I think that I was really thinking about even as much as 15 or 20 years ago when we were working in Boston to create these sort of youth-led walking tours. And I see Sue Gogadian back there, and I see Bob Krim, folks who are on the board and building this work around young people, knowing their family history, knowing the stories of their neighborhoods, using their stories to educate a larger public, using those stories to create a greater sense of place attachment, a greater sense of ownership of their cities. So to have that happening outside of again, the machine of city government, and now to kind of bring that kind of vantage point inside of City Hall has felt a little bit disorienting at times, I have to say, but an important question, because I think it raises up for me the stakes in terms of where we sit as folks that care about history, who care about public history, and who care about the preservation of the stories that are not just about who we want to be, but they have to also be stories about who we don't want to be, in the necessity of preserving those kind of stories. So I think, Brian, to your point about how big that narrative can be, how much of an appetite do we have around being very uncomfortable around stories of dispossession, economic dispossession, racial dispossession, all kinds of gender variances. There are all these ways that we are so worried about what we don't want to know or remember that it definitely puts us in a very dangerous place about what it is that we're producing by avoiding the uncomfortable, painful, true, I would call it. And for me, it has been one of my deepest feelings of love and appreciation for my own family's struggle and their narrative to move from the South to the promised land of the North and still try to make this place make sense because they feel like they own it, and they do. And then the question is, what is the responsibility that we share in this room to make sure that more and more people feel that way too, because in truth, that's the only way that I believe that preservation can be real, because it has to be so deeply rooted in all the communities that our stories and our landscapes touch. It has to be held. So I think I'll leave it there. And for me, this question about how museums and preservation societies are often sites of conquest and conformity deliver a challenge to how we think about what we're keeping in what we're allowing to stand out. So challenging that conformity for me so much is what the very best of what the Mass Historical Society has been about. When I look deeply into the incredible collections that are here, there are very powerful lessons for us, and I hope that through the conversation, discussion, we can think about more work to be done, certainly in this city and possibly beyond.
I'll just pose a couple of questions, and then we'll open this up to the audience as well. It seems to me that when historical organizations are conscious of their authority and they want to decenter their privileged position, they will go in a couple of different directions, either sharing authority with their visitors or taking on perhaps an advocacy role. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how we share authority with visitors and how we share authority when a visitor's worldview may include alternative facts or may include what we would consider non-negotiables. How do we steer them toward an understanding of history without being prescriptive?
Well, I think the question of how one introduces the idea that there are multiple narratives that I got a note today from a friend in New Orleans who went to a civil rights museum in Mississippi, and she thought that the interpretation was so tired that it presented the civil rights movement of the 60s as a kind of fait accompli, as a thing that was done and didn't need to continue to be done. And she was very frustrated with that. And so she was asking me, how does it happen that visitors like her can have a way of inserting their own uncertainties, their own open-endedness to this question, so that, you know, and it's emblematic of a larger question in a certain way. It may be ironic to some people here that we should be rethinking civil rights museums, but we really do need to because of the events of our own decade. And so I tried to think about this, about the ways in which the visitor's own experience of the last 2 decades, in this case, as a woman in her 40s, growing up in the South, and how the institution could in fact begin to incorporate those kinds of multiple narratives that begin to question and challenge the kind of interpretation that's given. And now we have technologies that actually allow us to create those conversations. It starts with the idea, I think, that the visitor is filled with ideas. You know, when I started out, we had this idea that the visitor is like the Monty Python character. You open up the head, and we're just going to pour in all that historical knowledge. But if the visitor is in the middle of a conversation about race, about politics, as they are going to a museum like that, in a sense, the museum needs to establish almost from the beginning that it is what we have come to call a dialogic institution, that it's actually cultivating a conversation. And it needs to register that conversation in what gets onto the walls and into the kind of physical sense of the space. So that there is, now, that doesn't really abrogate Brian's very good point that there is also a role for the professional historian. And the professional historian needs to be a part of that conversation and to say, this is emblematic, this is part of a larger story. Isabel Wilkerson took the story of these 3 families and put them into a very large context. And that kind of combination of the personal narrative and the kind of large-scale overview, in my work I've always thought about the kind of balancing of overview and immersion. there's a lot of immersion in Ken Burns's Vietnam series. If you go to the New York Historical Society, as I hope you will, to see the new exhibition on the Vietnam War, you will also see a lot of that kind of face-to-face, coming face-to-face with the experience of real people, the stuff that they, as we said, the things they carried, but also with these larger kinds of structures of meaning about the domino theory and the fear of communism and the way in which the political system failed us for so many years. So in a certain sense, I think the balance, the conversation between overview and immersion, between what the professional historian does and what the wonderful John Deweyite teacher does to engage people's emotions and knowledge, I think is really a critical part of that process. I'm very optimistic. I think that's not to say that the visitors, content, there's a movement now to have something called the user-generated content. And that reminds me of those things at the ballpark where they play these songs and they say, was this song written in 1997 or 1998 and who cares? It's a completely trivial thing. So what the visitor needs to do is to be engaged in being asked very deep, very powerful, challenging questions, and then those responses need to be entered into a kind of conversation. So that's the way that I think I would see that happening in that and that's the role, I think, that we play.
Me next? Well, I have to confess that I went to an elite college. I'm not the only one in this room, I suspect. And I went to an elite, a couple universities. And when I said that historians bring a multitude of different perspectives to public history and institutions, it was only in a limited sense of the term because, to a certain degree, we're all part of the same town. And the range of perspectives that comes to our institutions in our publics is vastly greater than what professional historians within the institutions can bring. And because we have the credentials that are bestowed upon us by our institutions, we tend to consider ourselves the historians and perhaps not provide as much acknowledgement to the fact that everybody brings a certain historical perspective to material. In some cases, the visitors that come to our institutions, a vastly greater perspective than we ourselves can, in addition to the fact that they can bring much more material, much more original source material, or material that really belongs to be a part of the story that we've circumscribed by the narrow perspective that we within the institutions bring.
Would you like to add?
Sure. I think that this question around, for me, what is it that we're intending or we're hoping that history can do? And if it is fundamentally about us having a look in the mirror at not just ourselves, but the stories about ourselves that we want to tell and those stories that we don't tell, to me, or don't want to tell, to me that fundamentally upends sort of this idea of a sole expert or historian elite. So I feel like a lot of my perspective in this is certainly influenced by so much amazing work in the 70s and 80s around sort of the history from below movement and rethinking how do you even imagine the audience? Because I think, Kate, when I think about how you structured even the question, it set in motion this kind of opposition between the institution and the audience, or the expert and the audience, and I think that is there's something very alienating about that, and we've all experienced it because people don't want to come to some of this kind of a setup. They want to engage, they want to generate their own content. Everyone has, right, a smartphone, as Richard was saying, is on Wikipedia, is probably trying to outwit your own story that you've created for them. So how do you allow for that, to allow for a much more sort of dynamic engagement where the idea of who knows the most, that cannot be the most important question that's on the table. It's got to be around kind of what are we grappling with together, and I think about sort of historians that do that well, kind of let you interrogate the bigger question with them. That's got to be the lesson for our institutions as well, because that is the thirst. When I think I run into the Freedom Trail visitors almost every day, just because I'm downtown and I'm going to lunch. And sometimes I listen in to some of the tours that are going through, and I see someone in a hoop skirt or someone in like a peplum or something, and I want to know, what's the conversation? And so there's this interpreter who's speaking, or someone in a megaphone, and then there are all these people who are trying to fact check what that little person is telling them on the tour, or they're trying to play Pokemon Go, or they're doing something else. And so the idea of who your audience is, what they're looking for, what kind of experience can we allow for them, I think it's got to be, again, it's much more than who knows the most. It's got to be around how are you engaging this narrative, this moment in history, this building, this object of material culture, to think more broadly about what are we looking for together. So when I think about some of the most successful or engaging days we had at my town, it was always around young people engaging a larger public of other youth or adults in the big questions. So if we went back to the question of urban renewal in that 1960 moment, the question is kind of, what was the city that Boston was trying to make for itself? And so having the young person interpreter ask that to a larger audience or a group, it's a shared mission, right? If you're trying to answer this kind of question together. And so history will show us that there were different answers that were the result, but it's that quest for that bigger question. I think there's a real hunger for that kind of engagement, and I remember that from just being out with so many audiences, but I'm seeing that all the time, and so it would always make me suspicious of the word audience itself, and how can we think about it more as shared, as sort of collaborators, or as co-conspirators or co-adventurers together, in a way that's not just a fluff language, but in a way that's actually real and kind of gets you to go a little bit deeper in the story, and saves us, I would hope, from some of the superficiality that kind of demarcation of this is the person that knows and the rest of us, we're just here to take notes. I think it just doesn't work. Yeah.
I just want to say one word. Carolyn used the word infiltrate earlier, and it's very important that we recognize that widening the circle of who actually gets to do the interpretation is really critical to this. And I was part of a generation of people who came in at a time when there was some anxiety in the history business about allowing these children of immigrants, white immigrants for the most part, Eastern European and Southern European immigrants, to the president of the American Historical Association did a very famous speech in 1964 in which he warned that the entry of these young PhDs into the field would certainly result in a degradation of this telling of American history. It's been my experience, and I think it's, obviously the experience of bringing more people of color into this conversation, things just come out, are educed out of our history, out of the different experiences of our people, and we have, this is a particularly always challenged me in Boston. It's just, this is a tough town for this subject about the diversity of voices. And I just want to say, I think this is a really critical question about encouraging a much greater range of voices to tell this story, because I mean, Carolyn's story is something that I could not have conjured up out of my experience, and she brings to it a kind of richness and nobility and power. And there are other people who are South Asian, Southeast Asian people who are coming into this city and whose stories are also, not just that they will tell their own stories, but that they will see the whole story of Boston in a totally different way. And that's something I think we need in this town particularly to pay attention to.
May we take some audience questions? Toward the back, your hand was up first.
I think, and thank you so much for your question. certainly at the National Park Service, you're finding yourself on the other side of everybody's schooling, right? So all the ways that we have learned these stories wrong, whether it was in high school or college, you are going to receive the fruit of that. And so I think there's been quite a considerable effort by the Park Service. I certainly am thinking about the site at Faneuil Hall and the work that's been done to actually integrate that site with the Black Heritage Trail in the narrative, so that people, when they come into the visitor center, that they're coming to a much more dynamic, a bigger story of what it means to sort of come into this early colonial narrative. So the National Park Service and the Museum of African American History have taken that on as a project. And so that's worth not only pointing out, but letting that be known to your audience, right, to your visitors, that we have worked on this project of reinterpretation. And it's making me think very much of the work that Plymouth Plantation went through in the last 20 and 10 and 15 years to retell the Plymouth Plantation narrative as a bicultural narrative and as a bicultural institution. And there was quite a lot of work that the staff had to do there and the leadership to let visitors understand that the institution had taken on this project of reinterpreting the story, recreating a new framework around it, so that you are getting for them, right, the 17th century narrative of the English colonists, the Wampanoag story, and you're getting a story that's on two tracks, that's not going to reconcile, that will be in conflict, that will be divergent at times. And so there was an incredible effort to create educational materials explaining again that this is a bicultural experience, and it will not be, it will be unfamiliar, right, for anyone who had visited Plymouth Plantation 30 years ago, like when I was a kid, because when I remember going there, and I remember coming back as an adult and that feeling of, wait a minute, this is very different. But the question I have for you is, what is the work that the Park Service can do or will do to let folks know this is not your grandmother's, right, experience? And so that's a critical part, because otherwise I think people will not know what to do with it. But to also explain that I think changes in the historiography as well are demanding that there is that level of revision, of kind of retelling the narrative, so that folks can benefit from what is not only different ideas about interpretation, but different truths that have come based on research, based on scholarly revelation.
I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you and all those people here who stand on the front lines of public history and deal with the public rather than sit behind a mahogany table and preach to the converted. Because this is really where the raw material encounters the audience for which it's intended. And I think that in many cases, the audience is shaped by a multitude of different narratives. We all, in dealing with the facts that we have, try to fit them into a story that makes sense. And there are many stories that collectively, I think, can form a very rich mythology in the larger sense of the word. Stories that aren't necessarily not true, but represent a significance that's larger than just the bare facts. And in the case of American history, there are many stories that are equally valid to tell, and clearly some of our visitors are wedded to a particular story that they want to hear told again and again. And it's not necessarily the wrong story, but it can be so much richer. We can tell a story of American history that represents lots of different aspects of the story. And I think it's possible to convince our visitors, our publics, that it's so much more interesting than just the same one that we've heard over the years.
I think one bringing visitors into the process of reinterpretation is important. So if you start by saying, 30 years ago, if you had come here, this is what we would have said, and then you pull out the sale, the slave sale, the documents registering the sale, or the arrival of enslaved people at the port of Boston, and you just really pose the problem alongside the visitor. How would you make, you make copies of that, you put it in laminated and pass it around, let the visitor actually say this aloud so that they can read the things. And we did the Slavery in New York show. We had a document in which the governor sent his secretary down to the market to buy several cloves of garlic and a slave. It was so trivial and so easy to sort of put that, when you put that now, it's much easier and more powerful, I think, if I could have had the document to be able to give it in the hands of each visitor and have them say it back to me. So I think there's a way in which allowing visitors to handle the evidence themselves, decipher that handwriting as we do, and try to come up with an understanding of what the story is. How could you explain this? How do we actually come to understand that a fairly substantial portion of the population of every port is going to have Africans in it, that the streets would have been filled with people speaking these languages that now we think of as only arriving on these shores in the 1980s or 1990s, but the people who spoke Mende and Fa and so on in this place. So I think it's a matter of just sharing that process. That's I've always found that people love handling the material itself. So.
Could I toss that question to Brian, and then we'll get another question in before we wrap up?
I agree. Now, there are many stories that can be told, and we have the advantage here in Boston and Massachusetts of having some of the most important stories, because some of the basic ideas that underlie the foundations of the country were worked out here. And it's a story that I think is still can be told better, because it's still not out there. The story of Thomas Hutchinson, incidentally, was recently dramatized in a piece of public history at the old State House, in which Thomas Hutchinson was the main character. So you looked at the events of the day after the Boston Massacre through his eyes. And now, coincidentally, you stood exactly where he and others stood 250 or so years ago.
Bob, will you wrap it up for us?
Well, I was struck by the fact that the term public in public history needs to be unpacked more. It seems to me it's now an ideal far more than a fact. It's an ideal of the civic culture in which we want to be involved, we want everyone involved. Mm-hmm. But the idea of the public in reality is fracturing and disintegrating. It becomes the task of public history institutions to try to reconstruct the very ideal and existence of the public at the same time. It seems to me that there are a couple ways that this can be done. One is to think about public history museums as acculturating institutions. Acculturating not just for immigrants, but for everyone. Acculturating them to the civic world of which we're a part. The one ground rule is you can't participate if you believe other people should not participate. You know, that if you accept that we're all participants and we share this world together, then you're part of that acculturation. And it seems to me that that's the only way we can really carry on democratically in these institutions. The other thing I would add is that I found both in writing and thinking about museums that a focus on choices made by individuals and groups is often a key to understanding to reconstruct the framework in which people lived in the past, so that we can present the dilemmas they face, not just choice in the narrow sense of how do you vote, because people aren't always aware of the constraints of history upon their choices, the limitations they face, but to immerse people in the range of choices that others have faced seems to me to be a way to open our historical understanding.
Thank you very much for that. And I would like to, I'm going to give Richard the last word because I'm going to quote you. Because there was a wonderful quote in Curating America. Richard said that public history is a political act. It's a political act in the broadest sense because it is, quote, on behalf of the entire body politic, end quote, that we as public historians aim to make things of great value accessible to all. And on that note, I would like to thank our panelists sincerely for a wonderful conversation, and please join me in thanking them.